Hey everybody, robots. That is a word that's conjuring up some terror in some employees today. Actually, it's also a time of great joy for some employers. Why? Because employers feel that robots and artificial intelligence will allow them to reduce the amount of money they're spending on wages. Let's balance that with, are organizations required to? Do they have a fiduciary responsibility to employ people? Is the role of an organization to employ people that can then buy their products? It's really the central issue when you have robots and artificial intelligence. We're now seeing that 8 out of every 10 jobs that are gone because we don't need people anymore. Are we going to get to a point where we don't need people in the workplace? Of course not. Are there going to be more jobs taken over by robots and artificial intelligence? Of course. Where's the balance? Where do organizations fit along the spectrum of working towards not spending as much money for employees and then also funding the next generation of consumers? Who knows where that's going to end up in the next coming years? That certainly is an issue of great debate today. So let's talk about robots in the first place. What we know about robots is that they're fairly easy to use. They're also expensive. They have to be maintained, but there's a whole host of issues that you avoid by buying a robot. Not hiring, buying a robot. I'll talk about how that's going to impact HR in a second. Let's talk about buying that robot. Once you purchase that robot, many of the other human aspects are no longer up for debate. For instance, vacation, sick leave, all of that gone. Holidays, no longer for robots. But the most important part that we often neglect is, while we remember and we recognize the cost of a robot, we don't think about the other ancillary additional costs that you avoid. One of the most important is actually lawsuits, conflict, communication, teamwork, all of those aspects that come when human works together. We're seeing, for instance, that the need for attorneys within organizations, at least employment type attorneys, is going away. Is it ever going to go away permanently? Of course not. But it certainly is not going to increase as much as it did. For instance, from the 90s on, we had issues with disabilities and many positive aspects about making the workplace more accessible for people. Again, very meritorious, advantageous aspect, but costly if you're an employer. If you can hire a robot instead of a human, all of those aspects go away. So what we have seen is it's not just the hourly wage, even the benefits, which are additional about 40% of a person's salary. What we're seeing is so much of the other aspects are actually being eliminated. Figures for legal expenses vary, but it's usually around 6%. 6% of a firm's expenses are related to legal aspects. Of course, if you employ more people, it's going to be a higher percentage. But when you have robots or even artificial intelligence, so many of those costs are eliminated, if not significantly reduced. So what we see is the movement towards robots and the movement towards AI is certainly going to gain speed. Is this new? No. In World War I, most people don't know, the British military did develop the first pilotless powered aircraft. Quite interesting, right? We're talking World War I, 1917, somewhere around there. Autopilots, of course, are commonplace. People think, oh, I can't believe that happened that long ago. Just think of how long we've had autopilot within our airplanes. Even people think sometimes, autopilot, how could that happen? I'm not sure how some kind of mechanism can fly a plane. And I'm thinking to myself, and as I mentioned to them, but who's flying the plane now with some kind of mechanism, some kind of computer? They've developed some mechanism, some engineer has designed a system, a chip, that allows that airplane to fly in one way or another. Of course, chips are in vogue today. 100 years ago, they didn't have chips. but someone designed, based on aerodynamics and others, of a pilotless airplane, an airplane that could fly, and all you had to do later was figure out what kind of aspects a human added to that airplane, and then add that there. Pretty simple in a way. That changed the way that the airplane industry works. Other aspects has happened as well, but we go back to the labor demand for people. If we now have robots, if we now have artificial intelligence, we certainly need fewer employees. By 2030, they're expecting about 30% of jobs, 35% of jobs to be eliminated. Those jobs would not be replaced by humans. As I mentioned, 8 out of 10 jobs that are eliminated because they don't need a human anymore. For those reasons, for the reliance and the increasing importance of robots and artificial intelligence, what we're seeing now is this movement within human resources, for one. We'll talk about management in a second, but let's start with human resources. We no longer need human resources in the same way that we did. We need some of the functions that they did, but if you're not hiring, evaluating, compensating employees because there's fewer employees, then what's HR to do? Job of HR isn't going away. The title of HR is. They're going to become much more of a resource, almost like operational resources, operational management. It's not going to be dedicated just to people anymore. We're going to be looking at employees and other aspects to do the job besides employees. So when a job becomes vacant, or when a current job maybe has a question about whether we need that job anymore, a previously known as human resources professional, but now we'll call it just resources, is going to look at the type of tasks and responsibilities that need to be accomplished, and then they're going to determine who can do that. Do we need a human to do that? If we do, how should we employ that human? Should we employ them full-time, part-time, contract consultant? We do know that 90% of all jobs today are contract consultant type jobs. Many of the full-time jobs, which we would call permanent, are for industries where there's very little competition. Government, for one, hospitals, another. Education, slightly. Those are industries that, while they may not be immune to competition, they're certainly not exposed to competition as much as others are. So for those reasons, those industries aren't as worried about artificial intelligence because they don't have to be efficient and effective. They can continue to spend monies in excess of what they need to because competition, a competitor, is not going to force them to do something differently. So if you work in the private sector, except for hospitals and maybe for-profit education, then it is going to be more problematic in the private sector in terms of jobs. You may have a job for some years, but then the job is all of a sudden taken over by a robot, artificial intelligence. We're going to talk about outsourcing in just a bit. But what we have learned is there isn't any limit to what an employer can do to eliminate an employee in their workforce. So when I talked earlier about is it the employer organization's responsibility to fund employment for a generation, for people in their community, the answer is almost emphatically no. They do not see it as their responsibility to spend monies that they don't need to in order to employ people, because their competitor may not have that philosophy. Their competitor may say, if I don't have to employ people, I can reduce my costs. If I can reduce my costs, I can reduce the amount of money I charge for my product or service. If I can do that, I can gain more customers. If across the street somebody else is now hiring people so that they employ a generation, their costs are going to be higher. Their products are going to be higher, more expensive for the consumer. The consumer may say, I don't want to spend the additional monies for that product or service because over here they're much cheaper and it's the same level of product or service. So even if you have this kind of noble ambition to employ people, even if that's part of your ethos as an employer, unless everyone in the industry does that, you're going to find yourself very quickly out of business. For those reasons, we and organizations need to be efficient and effective. We need to make sure that we spend our money wisely. We do that by using the resources in our firm wisely. That means no longer human resources we're concerned about, we're concerned with resources in general. The task of a human resource professional, and remember, I told you I was going to talk about management in just a bit. The task of a human resource professional, i.e. now just a resource professional, is to figure out a way that you can reduce the cost to make a product or service so that the organization can provide its customer with the lowest cost product or service. And in doing so, they may guarantee a market for what they produce. If they are as efficient as their competitor, then they're going to have some equal competition and they may be able to stay in business. But if they can be even more competitive, to look at how to reduce their costs even more so that they can reduce the price of their product or service, they may have a chance over the longer term of staying in business longer. Now let's talk about management. Similar to human resource professionals, managers are going to have a drastic change in the workplace as well. We're seeing over the last 10 to 20 years a decrease in the chain of command, what we would call span of control. It used to be that managers would supervise between 5 and 10 people, 10 being on the high side. Now we're seeing that singular manager can hire and manage anywhere from 20 to 30 employees. Some people think that's impossible. Part of it is more of our employees today are smarter, wiser, more better trained, developed, and more educated. They certainly have greater experience. We train them better, we develop them as well. Educationally, they're far advanced than 20 and 30 years ago. It's pretty common that people have a college degree. If you don't have it in your younger ages, you can certainly go back to school and get it. So the competition is more fierce, but you're talking about a more experienced and educated employee. Because of that, they need less comment, support, direction from their supervisors. Supervisors are able to spend more time with more people because they don't have to spend greater times with just one person. That person's already trained and developed, has the knowledge to do their job, and the supervisor can spend time on other aspects. That means, especially when we move to robots and artificial intelligence, of course, that we need fewer managers. If you have fewer employees, you simply need fewer managers. Whereas before, in the 1800s, if you remember that most people were working on farms. In the late 1700s, about 90-something% of people worked on a family farm, an area farm. Then they started to build factories. Factories needed employees. Employees moved to the factories because technology allowed you to produce more on your farm, and therefore you needed fewer laborers on that farm. So these individuals went to town in order to work in these factories. It's pretty good money. But for the first time, you actually needed a manager, somebody to manage people. At some point, you had human resource professionals and other kinds of individuals directly related to the employee, because now you had groups of employees within a single building, and they needed somebody to manage and direct their responsibilities. Hence, that's when you had the rise of management and the rise of human resources. When we talk about robotics and artificial intelligence, the issues are so much more widespread, profound, than just, here's a robot, and we're not going to hire a human. The consequential aspects related to the movement from humans in the workplace is going to be quite profound. We're going to see a tremendous change in the way that we manage the workplace. Workplace is going to be smaller, certainly more educated, and we're going to be looking at ways that we can continue to be efficient in the workplace. We're going to look for ways that we can not hire somebody, instead hire a robot, or to move towards artificial intelligence. That's going to affect the labor market. We talked about just getting a job and how it's going to affect employees in their job. But we haven't talked about the economic viewpoint of having fewer jobs and more employees. We certainly know about supply and demand, right? So if you have a greater supply, the demand is low, what's going to happen? Wages are going to go down. The movement to AI and robots and outsourcing is not positive for the employee. Positive for the employer, of course. If you can get somebody else to build your product, then you can make a tremendous amount more money. And as long as you have somebody to buy your product, you're quite ahead of your competition if they're still employing employees. So we want to use a resource professional to figure out ways that we could produce more with less inputs. Salary is an input. And by doing so, we're able to at least increase or decrease the amount of money we're spending to produce a product or service. Whether we then reduce the price we're charging for it is up for debate. If you have competition, you would. If you don't, then you can still reduce your costs, and then you're just making more profits. That's in some ways the hope. And that brings us to the last part, which is outsourcing. We're talking about robots and artificial intelligence, the effect on resources and managers. Outsourcing says that it's too expensive to produce a product in the United States. We know that to be true. It is too expensive. It's more expensive to produce in the United States than a number of other countries. Just within our borders, both Canada and Mexico in particular, it's much cheaper to produce a product in Mexico and to ship it to the United States. We don't need to employ some type of clerk or analyst in the United States when we can move that job, that position, that duty, that responsibility to another country, a country that doesn't require us to offer the benefits that the United States does, who doesn't require us to spend a considerable amount of money for a plot of land to build a building. Regulations in a state like California are almost prohibitive to any type of development. You have to do a CEQA, which is a term that means that you have to do some type of an environmental impact report, an EIP. And that is going to dictate to the city what could be harmed within your environment as a result of you expanding your office or building a manufacturing plant. The amount of permits and regulations that you have to follow is almost an aspect that will prevent nearly any firm from opening up that business. And of course, if you don't open up businesses, what happens is there's no jobs for people and taxes from sales that result from those people working and that building being built. But there seems to be more of an emphasis in some governments to protect the environment as opposed to provide employment. That's not an exclusive relationship. You can't have both at the same time. But in some states within the United States, like California in general, what we have seen is it's moved to where it's better not to have employees or people working within an organization, and instead to save the environment. Whether that's true or not, who knows? Whether we would make that decision, who's to say? But there is an effort to protect the environments more than necessarily to provide jobs. The second aspect of that too, which is as important, is when you increase the cost of employees, and then what you're seeing is it pushes employers to figure out how not to employ people. It's in some ways interesting that this movement towards robots and artificial intelligence is occurring as there's so many states demanding some type of minimum wage. In fact, it's an escalating minimum wage. California has been increasing the minimum wage about 50 cents every year. People forget, though, that it's not just the minimum wage jobs that are increased. If you have a minimum wage job and then a lead and then a supervisor and then a senior supervisor and then a manager, all of those positions have to get a raise when your lowest of workers get a raise too. Otherwise, you have what's called compaction. You could have an instance where your lowest paid worker is being paid more than your lead worker. That's one reason that we adjust the ranges or the rates, also known as the steps, for positions. If you raise the first line employee, which is the person closest often to the customer, as an example, Subway, their lowest paid individuals are usually what they call the sandwich artists, the people who make your sandwiches. But then they have lead people on each staff. If you were to give a 50% raise, since the differential between the two positions is not great, you're going to have to give that same increase to the supervisor. Otherwise, why would somebody want to be a supervisor for the same pay? And then you have a manager, store manager, and if their employees are making more money, you're almost obliged to increase the cost of the wages of your store manager. Interestingly enough, if you start to look at food, food is actually getting smaller. The McDonald's the other day got a Big Mac. I was somewhat surprised about how small the Big Mac is. Same, obviously, with some of the other stores. Carl's Jr., they have Cokes, Pepsi. And it's quite expensive for a Coke or Pepsi, but in order to rein in their costs, they've actually lowered the size of an extra large, medium, and small Coke. So even though the costs are going up, the size of the product has went down. Like with Big Mac, it seems smaller than it was years ago. McDonald's says that's not necessarily true, but it does seem smaller. I'm not sure how it looks smaller. Sometimes with age, as you age, you think that stuff in the past may have been better. But in this particular instance, it does seem that they have smaller product sizes, which we call portions. That could be the case, in addition to the escalating price, could be the case, mainly because when you have higher wages and you can't raise the price of your product so much, you have to start lowering or reducing the size of your product as well. Outsourcing. If you can move it to outside the United States, you can move it to outside regulations. As long as the price that you have to pay to move it overseas and then the price to move it back in order to sell it is still less than if you were to produce in the United States. In some cases in Mexico, it's 90% cheaper in terms of labor. As long as the transportation costs from the United States to Mexico to make the product and from Mexico to the United States to return the product and sell it are cheaper when you add in the transportation costs, then it can be done. But even with wages lower in Mexico, if the transportation costs were so high, then it would be prohibitive of a company moving operations overseas or to other parts of the continent, because to ship the product back once it's been produced, would be prohibitive. That's some examples and some thoughts on labor demand, on labor rates, on robots, artificial intelligence, and outsourcing. All impact organizations. Most importantly, they impact employees. Because now employees are competing against non-humans for jobs. If the costs and the responsibilities to manage employees, humans, people, becomes prohibitive, what you will see is that a greater push to move responsibilities towards others, more non-human aspects. So humans, employees, should really work hard to make sure they don't make it difficult to work in an organization. If they make it difficult, burdensome, if the costs are too high, organizations should look for any task, any type of option to reduce the pool of people that are working within the organization and instead rely on some type of mechanism, some type of computerization. That, everybody, I hope you enjoy the day. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, and I look forward to our next conversation.